The Fayette Mall Incident. On the evening of the 25th of May, 2016, an incident occurred at Lexington's Fayette Mall. The official narrative as to what happened was that some sort of shoplifting-spurred fight had broken out involving a dozen or more shoppers in the building. But from the beginning, the massive response which was brought to bear for such a seemingly mundane issue seemed strange to all onlookers who were there to see it. Rather than a few cars being dispatched to wrangle the trouble and make any necessary arrests, more than 100 police cruisers poured into the lots of the mall complex, a number which, it would later become evident, represented the entirety of the active police force of the city on the night of the incident. For over 4 hours, the entrances and exits to the parking grounds of the mall, including all the associated restaurants in its orbit, were cordoned off, with none being allowed to come or go. About a half hour into this blockade, several dozen state troopers called in from Richmond and Frankfort had joined this perimeter, and ended up operating the checkpoints at the entrances to the mall proper. Yet more poured in during the confused hours which followed. None who had been inside during this incident, whether employees of the stores within or shoppers caught in the chaos, were permitted to leave without undergoing brief questioning at these checkpoints. They took particular interest in those who said they had been in the food court, or the walk of storefronts which opened onto it, the place, they claimed, where this brawl had occurred. Those foolish enough to let slip they had taken videos or photos that day were encouraged, briskly, to delete these in view of the officers on watch. It was past midnight before the place had emptied out. Only 6 arrests were made, and the young men scooped up that night would never, in the end, after much posturing in the months that followed, be charged with anything. And yet 5 people would never emerge from Fayette Mall after that cool night in May. Their cars left vacant in the lot, and their families left grappling for answers which never arose. The interior of one of the stores adjoining the food court, Castle Jewelers, had been irreparably damaged during the course of the night's events in ways that seemed far stranger than any simple robbery or riot could cause in so short a span of time. 2 of the 5 missing had been operating this store, and the other 3 had, authorities speculated, been inside during the incident. No bodies or real traces of tangible violence, like blood spatter or weapons believed to have been used in an assault, were ever recovered, so far as authorities let slip. There was some clamor over this throughout the remainder of 2016, as the families of the missing grew more and more frustrated with the stonewalling of Lexington's officials. But as is the nature of such things, culture and discourse and outrage rolled on to new targets as time marched ever forward. The shoppers and employees of the mall, too, remained remarkably silent, save for complaints about the inconvenience posed them by the police blockade. Though I am sure that there are still letter writers and call makers today pestering the city police and state troopers for releases of information about the happening in Fayette Mall, few today spare that decade-old spasm of strangeness and obfuscation much thought. It has become a footnote, an obscure curiosity, the sort of fare only openly discussed by people with a dime to grift off late-night internet drifters, looking for a taste of conspiratorial mystery before they slide off to sleep. But the Fayette Mall incident was only one among a string of strange circumstances which arose that night, while the police in Lexington were all seemingly occupied with haranguing evening mall-goers. The small bluegrass airport in town diverted all flights to Louisville or Cincinnati until morning, claiming that their air traffic control arrays were malfunctioning. The low trickle of traffic the airport receives kept this a relatively minor blip on the radar for Lexingtonians, though testament to it can be easily found in back-page reports made by local newspapers. Neighborhoods and apartment complexes on the western and southern edges of town, from Beaumont and Harrods Hill through Robinwood and Monticello, experienced blackouts despite the clear and chill weather. This situation was made all the stranger by the fact that these power outages were inconsistent, with lights flickering off for an hour, returning to life the next, and then blinking out again later in the night. Electricity would be uninterrupted in Stonewall, only to die out just as neighboring Indian Hills got its power restored. The confusion regarding these outages, and the complaint calls which accompanied them, baffled energy providers in town as much as it confused the residents, for whether at headquarters or in the field, technicians could not find a source for the surges which caused them. But sometime past midnight, these interruptions ceased, and as is the way of things, within a week the outages had been all but forgotten. The bright night sky, too, drew its fair share of comment. Perhaps enhanced by the sudden darkness brought about by a large swath of the city losing its lighting, there were many reports of strange, ring-shaped cloud formations which coalesced in the sky west of Lexington, over horse pasture and rolling hill, only to dissipate to vapor and obscurity within minutes like disruptions on open water. Low and reverberating drums, far different than spring or summer heat lightning and thunder, sounded long through the night. The rich horse-breeding farms out that way reported several strange losses among their herds in the aftermath, a thing keenly noticed in a region famed for its extravagant lines of racing breeds. A dozen healthy young stallions and mares of storied competitive lineages dropped dead in their stables without warning of seemingly natural causes, and in a place where such beasts can be worth their weight in gold, this happening was perhaps the most widely discussed of the night's many strange occurrences. Most of the screaming, agitated animals which survived whatever was at work that night were found come morning to have thundered through the shattered doors of luxurious barns and bedded down in pasture corners, seemingly desperate to put distance between themselves and their dying kin. But whether it be cloud or droning call or equine death, these too would go unexplained, and the wealthy owners which suffered the losses were forced to silently eat the cost. None of these events have, so far as I've seen, ever been linked by observers, official or otherwise. All report or comment on them has either the tone of mundane recitation, or in the case of stranger things like the horse deaths, the tongue-in-cheek mood of humorous allusion to aliens or livestock mutilations. The forgetful weight of day-to-day existence has obscured these things, even in the minds of those who experienced them firsthand, and who can blame them? After all, the grueling concerns of life stack up, and to dwell too deeply and wonder too much on problems past is to ignore the duties of the present. But I have not forgotten. I have not been able to forget. And so long as what I saw that May night all those years ago lingers unspoken in me, I do not believe I will ever be able to turn my back upon it. What put me in that place where it all unfolded, so alien an environment to me, that night? It was, in the end, Thomas, an old friend of mine, who dragged me to Fayette that evening. He'd called me up to Lexington from Danville that night to play a session of a game he'd started up with some friends from classes at UK. Those sorts of tabletop excursions are nearly always a disappointment when undertaken with strangers, and though I'd been happy to fill in for my friend, I was also happy when the session ended early, and I escaped my obligations to them. We'd held the game at a small rented house tucked into the older neighborhoods across Nicholasville Road, opposite the mall which Thomas shared with a handful of other students. And when the crowd went their separate ways, he asked me to come over to Fayette and grab dinner with him so we could properly catch up. It had been a year or two by then since we'd talked in person, unmitigated by mutual friends. So, despite my lack of enthusiasm for mall food, or the loud crowds of teenagers and college students, I accepted willingly and followed him over to the food court. I don't blame Thomas, of course. He could not have known what was coming any more than I did, and his suggestion to head across the road and eat was entirely friendly. But it does seem a cruel cosmic joke that everything which unfolded that night dropped me there in a place I would not usually go, in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time. We went in with all the passive blindness of any who are visited by sudden disaster, blissfully unaware of what we were about to witness. The Fayette Mall food court itself is no strange locale. If you have seen a food court in a sizable American mall, you've more or less seen them all, regardless of which fast food franchises and pizza joints and Asian eateries rent up the stalls in them. The place sits just inside one of the mall's main entrances, and is comprised of a large, angular ring of cramped restaurant fronts surrounding a broad cafeteria-esque dining area in the center. The doors out to the parking lot are on the western side of the room, and the hall leading into the gaudy storefront-lined bowels of the mall itself are opposite them, on the eastern edge. We split and each grabbed what we wanted. He 2 slices of Sbarro and I a plate of relatively inoffensive rice from a Thai place. We met back up at a small table near the rear of the food court, overlooking the hall eastward out towards the interior shops. We could people watch there, perhaps the only real source of entertainment to be found in the mall for me, and we did just that as we caught up, making rolling commentaries on this overdressed couple or that unwashed teenager between reminiscences or recollections. Thomas complained about the course load he had, and I urged him to escape town and kayak or run with the rest of us more often, to extricate himself from all the plastic and get out into the real world again. It was pleasant, only tarnished in my memory because of the thing which brought the meal to an end. I can't say exactly when I knew something was wrong. Too much reflection has, paradoxically, clouded my thoughts about that night. I cannot know now what is inferred nightmare and what actually occurred. But the few times Thomas ever dared discuss the incident with me guardedly, he seemed to agree that there was something off before ever the noises and darkness came. Something subtle, and tied more to the intangible atmosphere of the room rather than any change in temperature or visibility. I remember that, as time dragged on, we both drifted off the conversation about future sessions of the game we'd been sharing, and spent a full minute or more staring off over our table down the East Hall, silent. The people there, too, seemed shaken somehow, with some seeming to hurry their paces and toss nervous glances over their shoulders as they bustled to leave the corridor, and others locking up and gazing around like deer scanning a woodline for a threat they sense, but cannot yet see. That was the essence of it, a feeling beyond articulation. I think we all knew something was wrong, and that wrongness, having crept up unexpected, grew stronger and stronger until even the least aware had to feel it in one way or another. It was near dark by then, when the unsettlement had fallen upon the food court and the shoppers' avenue beyond. Well past 7, the sun had all but set beyond the walls of the mall, and its light no longer spilled in through the doors and sunroofs of the building. The bulbs overhead seemed to dull in the hall in front of us. A low rumble sounded, far off and noticeable more as a vibration than as an audible noise. Heat, lightning, and thunder, I remember thinking, though the evening had seemed too cool for it, and the sky too clear and cloudless. A tangible chill came over me, as if cold rain were seeping in through my clothing, and I remember shivering despite myself. Thomas felt it too. He seemed on the verge of speaking, scooting back the chair beside mine, perhaps on the verge of suggesting we leave. Several groups around us, perhaps more perceptive and open to instinct than I, had already done so, not loudly or with chaos, but with measured, focused speed. But much as I wish we had acted sooner, that was not to be. We were interrupted before we could flee, and we both had front-row seats to what happened next. The hall in front of us was, obviously, lined on both sides with shops, with a pretzel stand out in the middle of the walk. One side was lined with clothing outlets with soulless names like VIP Fashions, and the other hosted a cookie shop, a makeup place, and a jewelry store at the end of the row, a local outlet rather than some arcane chain, I'd later learned, named Castle Jewelers. I still remember clearly the little castle motif of its sign, which jutted out from the storefront in mockery of tropey medieval street signs. How could I forget? It was the first sign whose struggling lights, waning and waxing with some unknowable flux in the power supply, winked out. The shop itself probably went pitch dark around the same time, leaving it, and the people who'd been inside, entirely obscured. Now, when I say entirely, I mean exactly that. In an instant, the interior of Castle Jewelers seemed to be absorbed by total blackness, as if the front windows and all which lay beyond had been doused in ebon paint or cloaked behind impossibly dark curtains. Several of the witnesses who were not badgered out of speaking about that night in the aftermath, always relegated to offbeat paranormal venues where their stories would be safely dismissed as nonsense by the parts of society presenting themselves as polished and refined, would describe this inky void as blacker than black, more deep and Stygian than any color descriptive could convey. It was as if the place within the jeweler's storefront had ceased to be, as if it had been cut out of the world about it, and we outside the front entrance could now see through the tangible reality in which we lived to some unnamed, yawning nothingness which waited beyond. This dark was so striking, so unnatural, that it somehow drew the eye just as insistently as would a glaring beam or burning flash of brightest light. There was not a soul left in that hall to and from the food court who wasn't looking at it, transfixed at the sight of something which could not be. Thomas said later that he heard screams just before the dark fell in there, but I can't recall that. My hope is that whatever happened in Castle Jewelers, it was too fast to allow for such things. Whether there were or weren't screams, though, any noise in the place was sucked from the air of the outer mall just as swiftly as the light had been. Again that low rumble, still far off, creeping unwelcome into the tense stillness. There was little rush or flight now. Those with instinct enough to flee had done so before the light in the store was doused. Now most stared, uncertain, perhaps enthralled. Mundane as what I'm describing may sound, I think all of us who saw it and felt it knew it was not right, not natural. Then the power truly went out, all at once. The mall beyond that hall and the food court behind us were plunged into darkness. Not the total darkness which had fallen in the store, but the natural, murky shadow of a blackout. Phones came out, and lights came on, and voices were raised in restrained, cautious alarm. Some, farther off from the epicenter of it all and apparently unaware of what was happening, laughed or joked nervously as they groped to find rails and tables to orient themselves, or shakily navigated away towards the exit doors. But no one in that hall near Castle Jewelers seemed to dare break the quiet, or the dark. Then Thomas had his own phone out, its shaky light flaring to life, facing out towards the hall. I almost stopped him, overcome with the sense that it would not do to be detected. Though I would not have been able to pinpoint it then, there was, I think, some part of me that felt the searching, probing presence of something else not far off, something I did not wish to be found by. But it happened so fast, and the quiet shadow of the surrounding mall made me so uneasy in itself, that I didn't make the effort in time. His light, as all phone lights, was not far-reaching. There were others, too, adding weakly to the gleam from other parts of the food court's east end as interrupted diners craned to see. The lights might not have been strong, even together, but in that gloomy soup of vague shapes and forms, it reached far enough. We saw, as half-discerned silhouettes beyond the edge of the light, the dozen or so shoppers remaining in the hall before us. But it was the woman closest to the Castle Jewelers storefront, Jill Oakley, I would guess from what we could glimpse through the murk, based on the reports on the missing which came in the aftermath, who drew our focus. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was the thing beside her which drew our straining eyes. The interior of Castle Jewelers in the background was still impossibly impenetrable to the gathered lights. Equally impenetrable was a sort of stretched, leaning silhouette which towered over the woman near the jeweler's open doorway. It was almost a single line at first, like a dark, out-of-place two-dimensional paint stroke made on a three-dimensional canvas, bending low over the woman who stood petrified there. Darker than any of the darkness about it, this curved line was near twice her height, and though it did not move in those opening seconds in the gathered phone lights, and though it had no discernible features other than its inky form, and though I had no reason to think it was alive, there was an unspoken, radiating malice about it. It had no head or eyes to speak of, and yet we all knew it was looking at her. Slowly, though I am sure the tense terror of the sight has stretched the event out in my mind, the line grew limbs. Like growth emerging from a flower's stem, two arms, if that is the right word, slid soundless and smooth from its center mass, as equally featureless as was the body. They splayed out wide and low and sluggish to either side of Oakley, if indeed this was Oakley, as if this living smear of darkest darkness was prepared to embrace her. A fluid, boneless cluster of tendril-like fingers was unsheathed from the end of each limb, still restrained, glacial in its slow determination. I was reminded of the subtle, almost imperceptible motions of a cautious serpent as it prepares to strike, positioning and gathering energy for a sudden burst of motion. I believe I knew what was to come next. The woman, too, must have known. She was gazing up at the thing which towered over her wide eyes glistening in the weak phone beams trained on the hall. But none of us looking on, in the hall or the court, made a sound or motion of warning or aid. We seemed all to know that wouldn't have helped, that she already saw the danger, and more, knew it was not possible to escape it. There was a keen hopelessness in all that darkness, perhaps radiated by the being itself, and for days afterward, I and others who had been nearby seemed to live our lives in a morass of aimless despair, which only faded slightly with time and distance. Ephemeral as the thing looked, it apparently was not immaterial or ethereal. It had mass and weight. For when it snapped its long, arched, vine limbs tight about the woman it had singled out, the breath was pressed out of her all at once like a hair in the coils of a constrictor, and the muffled crunch of several ribs radiated through the quiet walk into the food court beyond. These sounds were not loud, far from it. They would have been imperceptible in any other environment, muffled by passing footfalls and casual conversation. But all of us, looking on, had silenced even down to the holding of our breaths, and with the mall's lights not humming, and the ambient music of its sound system no longer playing, the noise of the thing taking her echoed through the mall as drips of water through a cavern. Then it pulled her fast into itself, through the long, dark line of its core. Though the line had no depth to hold her, the woman disappeared into its body as if it were a crevice in a cliffside. The line straightened, its vine limbs retracting into the core again, in one swift motion. When it again seemed a stalk of shadow dark even against the tenebrous surroundings of the darkened mall, it was impossible to determine its facing. But I was overcome with the certainty it was reeling and whirring, like the needle of a compass seeking its truth. The thing's truth, I did not doubt, was its next victim. Before long, my suspicions were confirmed when, just as stealthily and slowly as the arm things had emerged, the bottom of the stalk which formed its body split in two, and the being plodded as if on tiptoes, one bending limb before the other, towards another of the frozen observers in the hall. Behind it, I glimpsed first one, and then three, and then 6 more of the creeping things, just lines out of deepest dark to me, slithering out from the blackness inside Castle Jewelers, perhaps seeking their own victims. I had just enough time to begin to absorb the terror of that, of these haunters in shadow multiplying before my eyes. What strange and unnameable doorway had been thrown wide that night, and why would it have happened here? Never mind the many whats raised by their appearance. How many of the lean, limber things were there? How much damage would they deal there in the blackness? Would it all stop before they got to me? But before I could truly begin to grapple with all these questions, before ever I thought to turn tail and truly attempt to run through the dark for the exits, there was another loud rumbling, much closer this time. It roared like the crash of a waterfall in our ears, momentarily deafening every observer of the storefront, and the nameless beings which had skittered from it. The collapse, the folding, the implosion, for those, while all imperfect, are the only words I can think to use to describe it, came fast after that last rumbling noise began. The front of Castle Jewelers caved in on itself, as if pulled backward into the obscure darkness which had fallen within. The air in the building rushed in that direction, and I felt my ears chilled and my hair stirred as the artificial breeze whipped angrily by. The ground beneath our feet shuddered, and much of the lighter fluff scattered about the hall, the plastic leaves of fake potted greenery, the strands of deadened fairy lights affixed to the awning of one of the clothing stores, the paper and plastic trash of a nearby waste bin, was yanked into the dark as if a vacuum had opened up within. Perhaps it had. The things were pulled in with the refuse. Whether this is because they were light and easily moved, or whether it had more ephemeral, less tangible explanations, I cannot say. While a few of those petrified shoppers closest to the now vanished doors of Castle Jewelers stumbled or leaned in the direction of the void which had opened up there, and perhaps would soon have been pulled flailing in themselves, this did not occur. The rumbling stopped all at once, just as suddenly as it had begun, and in its wake, The dark space which had for those awful moments occupied Castle Jewelers had gone. Left behind was a ragged and ruined hole in the concrete and drywall and glass which would baffle investigators for years afterwards. The ceiling overhead and the foundation below were both equally scoured. There was not a single trace of the store to be found in the aftermath, whether of its decor, its offerings, or the unfortunate souls who'd been inside it. I've already described what happened afterwards. Indeed, you can find far more intimate and detailed accounts online. We were, all of us, subjected to strangely ambiguous interrogations before being allowed to leave by those in the police cordon, and fast learned by the example of those who were most honest that speaking about what we'd witnessed was a bad idea. I don't know if anyone genuinely photographed or filmed what happened, but the people on the ground responsible for the task did everything in their power to confiscate phones and go over them with their owners near at hand. If any shred of tangible documentation survived, I've never seen it. Even if it had, it certainly wouldn't make any impact on how seriously people might take the tale. After all, such things grow easier and easier to fake with each passing year, and as incredulous as the events as they unfolded sound to the outsider, there would be little trust to be had. I doubt any of the officers themselves, barring perhaps certain senior overseers in the state police, really knew what they were trying to contain. But a paycheck and a position is more than enough to tame most men and women. And the sad fact of the matter is that people told from on high to stop asking questions will almost always comply. I can't blame them for that, for their attachment to security and belonging. Not with the venom I once did. Thomas, just as a dozen other first-hand witnesses to the tragedy, did not survive to see the next decade. Though his death, unlike others, was not obviously suicide, I do not doubt the circumstances which led to it were related to what we saw that night. The gnawing hopelessness we all felt in the dark never left us, no matter how bright we kept our surroundings ever afterward. He never truly spoke of it with me, not openly. I imagine thinking on it hurt him just as much as it hurts me, even now. But I know from what he did say, and from those few who would speak, and I've done my best to find them, that none of us ever slept well again. It isn't so much the horror or visceral gruesomeness of the event that unnerves, but rather the questions and doubts it raised in us, along with the lasting sense of despair which accompanied them. I think it's something to do with the things themselves, or else with whatever dark crevice they crept from. A lingering, impossibly supernatural knell that rings on in each of our skulls when the shadows grow thick about us in life. But it is also possible that despair is entirely born of our own lack of comprehension, and the unavoidable worry that, at any time, such a thing might happen again. After all, far-fetched as it sounds even to me, I can't help but feel there is no rhyme or reason to what unfolded at Fayette that night. How, then, would one ever take comfort in knowing they could avoid a similar fate to the Taken, if ever it were to happen again? Thank you to channel members User Uzi, Fist Ninja, Marco Miklos, Foxy Paws Toddy, Gerard Santora, Vitor, Michael Clement, Timothy Pickett, Kung Tung, Billy Meader Jr., Trevor Canny, Bilbo's Stankface, Andrew Kane, Craig Sips, IT2, JHB, Americana, Julius, Cheshire Vapor, and Hoshea Kozilla. Thank you also to patrons Rob, Philip Blomquist, Josh, Magpie Fly, William Copeland, Jason Maki, BJ Drapp, Strawman 1103, Weapons and Stuff 93, Laura, Ryan Fahey, Luca Zanzi, Mike Miles, Boris Vulich, William Richardson, Jennifer Tran, Noah Kaplan, and JHB.